This is PPD. You guys are watching Thorn's YouTube channel. One of the only men with a bigger ego than even myself.
This is the 9th episode of my monthly video AMA where people who donate $10 or more to my Patreon, link in the description box below, are able to submit a question, and assuming it's interesting or good enough or not just something that's been asked a million times before, potentially it could be included in a feature like this. And so these are questions. A couple of them are ones that were left from months over that were interesting, so I stored them up just in case. And some are from the most recent thread. Expect right after you see this video, a new thread to be up on Patreon for my latest donators to potentially submit their question. So this one is from Paulson RL. It says, it's widely agreed that Glaive is the best in-game leader in CSGO right now. This is from earlier in the year. Especially given the fragging stats that he puts up as a tactical leader. Karrigan is usually viewed as a counterpart to Glaive, since he leads FaZe, again this is before he fully left, with a loose, skill-reliant style. My question is, would FaZe perform better if Karrigan was swapped for Glaive, since Glaive already operates with a team that is itself filled with skillful players and has immense success? Or do you think Karrigan's leading style matches the players of FaZe better because it doesn't restrict the fragging capabilities of Nico, Rain and Guardian? And he says he's an admitted FaZe fanboy, by the way. Right, the main thing to say about this particular topic is, first of all, I would just say I would definitely disagree with the premise that Astralis is filled with skillful players. Because I think in the context of FaZe Clan, the FaZe Clan we're talking about, and we're talking about FaZe Clan at some point in time where those players were as good as the name value suggests, I don't think Astralis ever was on that level, actually. I think to find an Astralis team that's vaguely close to that level, you have to go back to 2015 when it was TSM and they actually had Karrigan as fragging game leader. Not massively high fragging, but he certainly had his maps. And then Zipnik's, relative to the pros of his day, was, I think, an even higher impact support in the sense of raw frags, not maybe the sheer amount of clutches he'd win or how much better he looks than the other support players, but again, the sheer amount of raw frags you could potentially expect from it in a match, even though I'm sure in the Astralis era 2018 his stats were inflated. I think that's more due to the overall success of the team and the style and the strengths of the team. So the main problem I have in this sense is I don't see what Glaive's going to bring to FaZe Clan. Like, I think actually the players in FaZe Clan, I mean, you notice part of why I think they've been amazing outside of their careers in FaZe Clan is some of them, not all of them, all of Mice is an obvious exception, have been basically the standout carry of their teams and have had to overly carry, have had to hard carry all the time, which you would hope an elite player doesn't have to do when he's at the top level. So I think Karrigan's best suited to dealing with those kind of players, bringing them together into a cohesive unit. I don't think FaZe Clan has ever looked as good since he left as it did when it was at its peak with him. I don't think, quite frankly, it ever will, actually, unless you make some radical overhaul to the team. At that point in time, it's a different squad. So to me, the problem is Glaive's context, as you said, isn't just that he fragged well and did really well and success-wise in Astralis. It's the idea that he also fragged way better than he should have. Like, the numbers were way crazier than 2018 than you'd expect if you looked at it with the eye test. And then the fact that he was able to run this great tactical system. Now, I don't think that tactical system would be particularly good in FaZe Clan. I think they'd actually be probably a worse team overall than they were with Karrigan at their peak, with Glaive trying to run a very tactical system. So if we take away the tactical system, now we're just, looking for him to frag and do a loose style? I haven't really seen that he can actually do a loose style. It's not really Glaive's strength. You go back to Western Wolves, you look at his Astralis teams, he wasn't the main game leader of Heroic, and Heroic itself was a tactical team. I actually haven't seen any evidence whatsoever he'd be as good as Karrigan or a Karrigan style loose in-game leader. His strength's doing a tactical system, and that doesn't really fit the makeup and personnel of FaZe Clan, quite frankly. So even though Glaive may indeed, I'd probably even give him the edge, be a better in-game leader than Karrigan, I don't think actually he'd suit FaZe as well. And I don't think either style would work as well for FaZe with Glaive heading it up. Like, if they're going to go with a loose style, then why bother with Glaive? If you're going to go with a tactical style, why make it the FaZe Clan players? If anything, if you want a more interesting what if, I'd say something like, what if you took Glaive from Astralis and put him with the current North lineup? What would he do with that team? Would that shake the foundations of your faith in him as an IGL? If he couldn't make them a championship team, if he couldn't make them one of the best, if he couldn't fix some of these players, that's more interesting to me to know what people would think in that sense. Because the difference is, I can take Karrigan, put him on lesser teams, it's already happened with his mouse team, and expect him to do much bigger things than the raw names on the team might suggest. I don't yet know if that's the case for Glaive. Shantanu Pawar, it's an Indian name of some type, says, when did you start to feel confident about the modelling process you developed for a Counter-Strike team? What adjustments you had to make to generalise the model over the outcomes you observed? So the reason why this is a complicated topic is this is one of the downsides of the fact that back in the day, not everything was an article, or especially in the early days of CSGO, a lot of things went into videos and were discussed on talk shows, but I didn't always get them down into their own video, into their own written article. Generally, I have to say, written article especially is one of those things I wish I had more of these pieces. It'd be so much easier to search for them, find where I made a point, instead of having to try and vaguely remember where in a video I made a point. But what I'm getting to here is a lot of these sort of terminology aspects weren't in any way codified around the time I came up with them. So I've got to say, in terms of certain concepts, like the concept of even support player, etc., we had a concept for that, which didn't call it support player at the time in 1.6, in the latter 3 or 4 years of 1.6. That mainly came out of games like, I would assume Dota, because it tended to be more players from CS played Dota than League, but certainly MOBAs, League, Horn, Dota, etc. I think that's where support player came from. And I have to say, my own model of a great team mainly came from just looking at the greatest teams in the history of Counter-Strike and looking, right, where do the resources go in these teams? Because that's for one thing immediately I was actually quite far ahead of other people many years ago in figuring out was that there is a limited amount of resources in a team. Even though it looks like there's 5 guys, they all have AKs. In theory, they could all shoot everyone in the head, right? No, it's about who has space created for them, who needs space created for them, who operates best when they're going first in, when they're going second in, when they're the last one to come in. How does someone operate within a particular tactical style? But more importantly, when I looked at the balance within teams of how many like super fraggers do you want, how many role type players do you want, what should the IGL do, what should the AWPA do? If you look at the greatest teams in history, they generally fit my model. You know, the 2-star system, the 3rd star is a hybrid. He can potentially be more of a team player, or he can be more of a star player, or it can be something slap bang in the middle. Then you have the 2 supportive elements. You have basically your fragging core, you have your supportive core, and you have the one in the middle that, depending on the personnel of the team and who they are as a player, is going to go one way or the other, and it's skewing your team. You're either more of a tactical team player team, or you're more of a fragging individual power team playing around the stars. So as a result, the key thing about my model is it gave the basic blueprint in the same way as basketball has the 5 positions and football has 4-4-2 as a classic lineup. But just as in those sports, you don't have to play 1 power forward, 1 shooting guard. You could play 2 power forwards if you have the right team. Memphis Grizzlies would be an example of a team that did that back in the day. And we're only talking 5-6 years at this point in time. If you go and you look at a football team, there have been many teams that didn't run 4-4-2. There have been teams that run a single striker up front. There have been teams that run 3 strikers up front. I've even seen teams where, when they had the personnel, they've had, for brief periods in the game, run 4 people up front by taking one of the midfielders and making him an attacking player. So I think overall, the key for me is it's a basic model. Within the model, it fits all variants of teams. And once you start to understand this model, it immediately helps you put in place other teams, see gaps of what they might be lacking, see the teams that are destined for great things later. I think if you look at a team like ENCE, you could actually see a team that fit a lot of these roles, even though the fragging initially wasn't up to par. So I would just say the problem is it's something that's taken years and years and years. Like the core seeds of it were years before I ever expressed it publicly. Maybe things I alluded to on casts when I was a color commentator for IEM. Certainly would sometimes mention it offhand in interviews. And when I interviewed people, I had this model. I'd also throw in as well, you can see how many people in the scene have seen that video and have heard me use this terminology before. Because by default, when players meet me, this is publicly and privately, this is the model they use to talk about the game. I notice actually some of the great in-game leaders, Karrigan's a good example. I've heard them actually use this terminology of 1st, 2nd star, how you balance a team in how they themselves think of a team, break down a team, and look at matchups. So it's not that I invented all of it. I think some of it was it's a mixture of I was the one to express it, I was the one who codified the model. Some of it I did come up with, but as I say, some of it, in my opinion, just comes from observation of the game. I believe most of the narratives and analysis is in the game, and then yes, what skill set you bring will decide what you can draw out of the game, and then the overlap between your skill set and what is in the game is hopefully what you would call your analysis, and is what's going to be interesting to other people, because your unique aspects will bring out elements others won't, or in a certain way. So I would just say it's more like they themselves have heard what I've said, what made sense to them applied to their own observations of great teams over history, and therefore they thought, right, this is worth using for terminology now. It's one of the reasons why, even though, for example, Jonta, the former coach of Hellraisers, made this post not that long ago where he said that there should be different roles in the game, and Snacks implied there should only be 3 roles. It was like lurker, attacker, I can't remember what the other one was, anchor or something. Whatever his were instead of support player. The point is, those aren't simplistic enough. Those aren't universal enough. Those actually don't come with enough wiggle room. They make things too vague that they're just not going to be picked up as terms. Like the term support player, whether anyone says they exist or not, as a model, it's a very interesting piece of terminology that I think is beneficial over not having that and just having all these players be one or two things, or everyone be totally unique. I think actually that goes against the very premise of a model to say, no, we can't use a model because we must show every single person and all their unique differences. Well, no, that's not what a model's for. A model's for showing similarities, tendencies, categorizing things, showing how different categories interact and connect with each other. If you make it all about individuals, that's just a different task. You're not talking about the same thing. Right. Kolja G says, when did you read Infinite Jest and how did DFW's works impacted you? Right, so he's talking about David Foster Wallace here, and his most famous novel is a book called Infinite Jest. Right, I haven't read all of the book Infinite Jest, actually. It's one of those ones I started and never got through. Seemed interesting enough. It's just a very, very long book. And at the time, like my philosophy in terms of reading is I don't think you should force yourself to read anything you don't want to. I think you should read something, if it catches your interest, you keep going. If it doesn't, listen, there's a bazillion books out there. And I spent a lot of the money I made in the early days of eSports buying books that I still haven't read to this day. So I just read whatever at the time is interesting to me. And if maybe I get back into that person through some other means, maybe I go back and I reread it. But I'd certainly have no shame in my game about whether I finished a book, whether I didn't. I'm not out here trying to pretend to have read books I haven't read or trick people. I think that's kind of an immature thing for young people to do, want to pretend they're smart. So from what I've saw, I liked parts of it. I didn't find it super compelling in as much as I didn't finish it. For me, his works are less relevant in terms of the novels. I'm more interested in the essays, actually. Much like Christopher Hitchens, I love to read the books of essays that are out there. They all take a different tack on things. Much like Christopher Hitchens, you can read an essay on a topic you're not particularly interested in, but his writing will actually keep you going, and his own observations are interesting. I would say the biggest way his work impacted me would be it basically encouraged in me what other people might consider a bad habit, which is whenever I write columns, I'm not very good at being really concise and using kind of the iceberg principle and only giving you the most important aspects. I like to actually have aspects where I touch on something and it's like, of course, people consider that a fluke, and I can't just leave it there. I have to say, because in this tournament they did this, and give you the extra context, because I somehow love the idea that someone who was smart reading this article, who maybe doesn't know the game that much or knows the basics or only followed for the last few years and not before, can get real context for what's going on here, so the pieces fit together more, as opposed to him then having to kind of come with the burden of 3 or 4 years of knowing the game or extra details and only seeing hints at something and having to vaguely guess at what that means. So that's very much a David Foster Wallace approach. He was legendary for his footnotes, sometimes went in incredible depth, were entire paragraphs themselves at times, but gave interesting anecdotes, extra information, provided background analysis. That's something I actually have enjoyed a lot, and so I've continued to do it in my own work, and I haven't excised it as many people might want me to do to make for much snappier, shorter writing, even though sometimes as an experiment I have forced myself to do that. For example, when I had my Thorin's 1000 and I kept it roughly within 1,000 words. So I also would say, finally, I think it's a bit overplayed, the idea that if you really like an artist in some sense, like they have to have somehow shaped your life, have been super important to you. Can't they just be people who provided awesome art, the ideas that you were thinking about, things that you thought were cool? I'm not one of these people who thinks that you see what someone else does and you copy it and you go, oh yes, that's the best, I like him, so I'm gonna. That's not my stake. I've got my own style. So This is a super long question, so I'm going to make the gist of this. It's literally massive. I'm talking like 8 paragraphs. It was basically a guy asking me about when I lived in South Korea, and he wanted to know stuff like, how do South Koreans perceive North Koreans? Do they think of them as countrymen? Talking about some of the problems that they have with Chinese people insulting South Koreans and the relationships there. So he's wondering, is there a similar adverse relationship? Bringing up other aspects like the whole fact that North Korea has a totalitarian aspect, etc. And, is this something that the South Koreans are aware of? Like, for example, are they aware of the book 1984, etc.? Right. What I would say is this, is the relationship between South Koreans and North Koreans is not something I would claim in any way to be an expert on. I only know based on books that I've read about the history of South Korea and Korean itself, and then aspects like having spoken to a few South Koreans. But certainly I wouldn't take that as indicative of the whole population. What I would say, and remember, I'm mainly talking to younger people and people who can talk English and people who know a little bit about Western culture anyway, and perhaps even know what our notions of North Korea and South Korea are in the West, particularly through the American news media. So what I would say is this. South Koreans actually have a very interesting take in that, unlike other regions that have been divided along very harsh lines and in a very, quite frankly, almost obnoxious manner, like they've literally been at war, obviously, and they've now had this long, almost Cold War type period between the two countries. Unlike many other places that have that sort of divide, because it is only, we're talking like, 2 generations back that you need to go, something like that, to get to when, I'm not sure they count generations now. If it's supposed to be 10 years, then no, but if we're talking like 30, 40 years, it's like 2 generations since a lot of the problems happened. Interestingly enough, it feels like a lot of the South Koreans that you talk to do think North Koreans are Korean and that the two countries should be united in some way. They don't necessarily know how, and they might be afraid of some of the, let's say, violent rhetoric of North Korea, but a lot of them generally seem to be in favour of reuniting. Some of them thought it wouldn't happen. Some thought it was inevitable that eventually it would happen because ethnically they're the same. So it's very interesting. They seem to be a lot more positive than Westerners in general and didn't seem to be quite as worried. I will say as well, I at least get some sense that some South Koreans, they weren't quite as cynical as me, but they were a bit like me in that whenever a Westerner would ask me something like, well, aren't you worried that North Korea's going to bomb Seoul or they're going to nuke the place? I would always say, well, no, because for me, if you look at the country, fuck's sake. For me, if you look at their country, my basic read on North Korea is North Korea right now is about as good as it could ever get for the person who runs North Korea. I can't really see how reuniting with South Korea would make his position better. He would surely lose power, lose some of the almost godlike autonomy he has within his country. It certainly seems to live a life of luxury. He has wealth, he has computer games, he has the internet, he has everything he wants. So as far as I can tell, like, I don't think he wants to gamble everything. In the same way, I think like someone who's a mafia guy doesn't want to gamble everything and give up his territory and his power and all the rest of it. You only do that if it's guaranteed when you move up. Otherwise, you stick with what you got and you enjoy the way things are. So I think, quite frankly, a lot of what happens there is just saber rattling between North Korea and South Korea, at least in the past. Nowadays, it actually seems to be pretty reasonable relationship between them that's actually developing. So I personally never saw that big a threat. I was never myself worried, even when there would be those stories like, oh, they might go to war any minute. It's no surprise then it'd be like Monday morning, they had a meeting, oh, war's cancelled. It's like, I always expected it to go that way. So in terms of whether South Koreans know 1984, I've actually never heard of that. I've never brought that topic up, quite frankly. I would guess they probably don't. I have to go ahead and say this. A lot of Westerners know about 1984 and they've never read the fucking book. Like, the amount of people who've told me things are all willy and they're like 1984, blah, blah, blah. And then you start asking them details and you realise they've never read the book. Some of them haven't even seen a movie. They're just like, literally, I know people who think 1984 is actually what happened in that fucking Apple ad for the Macintosh. They actually think that that's like part of the plot of 1984. It isn't in any way. It just alludes to it, basically, and tries to use the atmosphere of it. Like, that's not any part of the storyline whatsoever. There's no overthrow at the end where they all wreck the main. In fact, I won't give you spoilers, but at the end it's fucking dark. But it should be if you consider the context of the world they were creating. Right. Pedro Rojas says, do you consider speedrunning an esport? Right. Speedrunning is where you try to play through a game or a level of a game as fast as possible. He then says, what tier would you put Fury in? But that was from a few months ago. So ALB in terms of my SAB class/tier system. So first of all, do I consider speedrunning an esport? Not really, because as far as I can tell, esports should be multiplayer, and speedrunning is basically single player. It's kind of just a time trial approach, isn't it? It's cool. Like, I've always found some of the defrag things quite interesting. Some of those speedrunning movies have been pretty cool. I also thought they were some of the best frag movies, actually. Not in terms of frags, but in terms of like movies to watch to enjoy esports content. Like, they would always have sick electronic music soundtracks. They would always be very well edited, actually, so a lot of really good ones. I don't really consider it an esport, though. Doesn't mean it doesn't have value. And then in terms of what tier to put Furia in, the reason I kept this question in is because it's actually a very tough one. Like, the problem is the eye test tells me actually they should probably be B tier, and that's at best they could be, because they shouldn't win a tournament. They shouldn't even beat the teams they're beaten so far in many cases. Fragging-wise, I think they're massively underpowered compared to most of the top teams. Like, even their best players, Yuri and Keserato, I see Keserato go fucking disappearing all the time. I think it's ridiculous how sort of underwhelming he can be when he plays against the top teams online. You put him against shitters, you might tear him up, yeah. I think Yuri's looked like the better player overall in terms of consistency. Even then, I think he's nowhere near sort of top 10 players in the world status if you look at who they are. So for me, the fact that they've been able to beat the likes of the Vitality, they've beaten Astralis in the best of 3, they've beaten North, they've beaten Fnatic, like, this is ridiculous stuff. So you look at the maps they've done it on, they were doing it on like 5 different maps as well, pretty even spread between them. I just don't really buy a lot of that. So the problem is, in terms of world ranking, I can't keep them out of the top 5, but it's bizarre that a team that sort of feels like a B-class team gets to be top 5. In fact, they're the one team that's kind of fucked up my tier system, because the whole point of my tier system before was that the tiers always did align with the world ranking generally. It's just I would make them shorter, whereas actually I think Astralis overall is a better team than Furia, despite the fact Furia is ranked above them, and in this scenario, in theory, is closer to getting out of the same class, even though actually in terms of class they probably shouldn't be. It's one of the problems between the difference between rankings and what you actually feel inside and what your gut would tell you, as opposed to what analysis of overall placings would be. Remember, one of the things about rankings is losing matches doesn't affect you. It's only other people winning can put them past you. Right? NateDOhDoubleG says, comparing UFC and esports, so he mainly means mixed martial arts, I'd personally say esports athletes get treated way better for what they put in. Why, even with huge deals with ESPN, do fighters see less profit from their work? Is it an issue with their content platform being antiquated? You've kind of hit it on the nail at the end there. So in esports, right now it's a joke, because actually players are massively overpaid, bearing in mind the industry itself doesn't make profit in most of the areas that are relevant to the context of the players we're talking about. Their teams don't make profit from them in the way that we'd overall need to justify where their salaries are at, where the expenses are at, them getting flying first class, business class around the world. So the interesting thing is, the UFC, MMA never had that. In fact, it's actually lagged behind the monetization, where, as you point out, it doesn't matter if you've got a huge deal with ESPN or Reebok or your massive broadcast rights deal with TV stations around the world. The problem is, how does the fighter himself get a cut of that? He doesn't. The UFC gets that money, and then the fighter gets paid by the UFC, or he goes to a competing platform where he's going to get less eyes on him, but potentially might get more money if it's a Bellator or something, and he's cream of the crop talent, and they want to pay for marquee names. So the big problem is, where's the fighter union that negotiates a percentage of the broadcast rights deals? Now, esports doesn't even have those things. It's just that we're in a weird position where, because of the pop and the hype of the industry that everyone's plowing money into, the knock-on effect is that at the moment, even themselves without proper unionization, players are getting, I'd say, way above and beyond what they probably should be relative to the rest of the industry and their level of investment in the industry, and even that's not really justified. So yeah, it's certainly a problem. I would say they put in more, as much as, yeah, obviously a UFC fighter could ruin his whole life, his health, his mental health for years and years off just maybe even 5 years of competing, 10 years of competing, whereas in theory in esports, I think as it goes on, you'll eventually be able to have 20, maybe even 30-year careers as a vaguely top pro, as long as you can put in the time, remain interested, and you shouldn't really have any serious injuries. So I see what you mean there in the contrast. I think UFC fighters are quite far behind. Some of them understand branding, and I think I let some of them get further ahead. That's why I didn't like the whole Reebok deal. Some of them I heard that were big names made a lot more before that in the UFC. They were themselves ahead of the game in terms of personal branding, personal marketing deals and sponsorships than esports players were. Esports still use their team, who essentially act as a kind of agent to get those deals, which they then share some of with the team after paying them a salary. And then I know in some cases for like streamers, some of the orgs a few years back were making 2 or 3 times what the streamer was paid it for that deal because they were the ones who brought the deal in, and the streamer himself wouldn't have been able to negotiate it. So there's pluses and minuses to both aspects. Hands on Keyboard says, in the past, I have noticed your appreciation of Magic the Gathering in terms of competitive format, where they acknowledge the random elements of the game, matchup and bracket, and as such emphasize top 8s, and also reached out to Patrick, the Innovator Chapin, on Twitter. What is your current / past relationship with game like, I see what it means, Magic the Gathering? I used to play some of those games back, let's see, when would it be now? Almost 20 years ago, I'd say, like my late teens, before I went to university. So I used to play those games quite a lot then because I was already into comics. I used to go to a comic book shop. People in the comic book shop, that was the games they played, along with, you know, Dungeons and Dragons or whatever. Those were the kinds of things that were played in those comic shops. So I was interested in it back then. I think it's a great competitive game. Not a fan of the fact that you have to constantly buy in, etc., and that they make things so expensive. I also think one of the stupidest moves they ever made was when they made Magic Online and they had to pay to buy the card again online instead of the Hearthstone approach. They could have been Hearthstone before Hearthstone. They would have killed it as well. And they would have been incredibly successful. I think that was one of the biggest fuck-ups of all times in esports history, but whatever. So I think it's a very good game. If there was no esports, it's the sort of thing I might be interested in as a hobby and might pursue, because there is esports and there's more hours than there's not enough hours in the day to cover all the things I want to in esports and esports history. It's not something I'm going to heavily invest in anytime soon, I don't think. I mainly reached out to Patrick Chapin because I thought he was interesting as a prolific writer and thinker, and I would like to have asked more abstract questions which were about Magic, but then gave me a chance to, in the same way as you can read Nassim Taleb's books and not have to know about economics and investing, try and draw out the philosophy, the most interesting abstract meta points that he made, because that's one of the reasons I enjoy reading his work. In that sense, and then take Tomo's ideas into esports. Because what I enjoyed about his writing is a lot of it you could strip out the things that were specific to Magic and still take some interesting observations or modeling about how he saw the game or how metas interact. And I've actually found some of his thinking very interesting in applying to games like League and Dota, with a constantly cycling meta that has all these different aspects and nearly always has people complaining about things being OP without understanding where the counters and where the counter meta will develop from. Perhaps that very thing being OP will produce the thing that destroys it entirely. These are things I think I've often lost on people who've only followed video games and haven't followed robust metas like Magic and the way that those games are balanced. So in terms of the format, yeah, like I say, I like the fact that because it's a game that is got so much RNG in it compared to a game like Quake, for example, that people do just look at top 8s. It's not just about whether you win the tournament or win the World Championship. They certainly have some pleb angles like that still, where they try to pretend that's the best player every time. But I mean, just look at Fortnite. That's what every idiot's been doing with those tournaments as well. So I think it's interesting in that sense. I like the fact that they acknowledge it. It's obviously coming from poker as well, where it's not about who wins WSOP main event, is it? It's about who the best player overall is in the cash games and maybe over the entire circuit, if you want to add it like that. So yeah, that's basically my main interest. It's not something I'm super deep into, even though I do find it quite interesting. Tristan Jones says, so there are obviously 4 teams that have had eras in CSGO: NIP, Fnatic, Luminosity Gaming /SK, and Astralis. But I think the SK era is hard to define because they were dominant in 2 different years with 2 different lineups. How do you define the SK era? Do you separate the 2016 and 2017 lineups and say there were 2 separate eras, or do you combine it into one? Right, it's pretty simple actually. I don't do either. First of all, an era is the time period where your team was the dominant force in the game and nobody truly displaced you within that era. Otherwise, the era ends. So, for example, if you thought there was an era for SK in 2017, then that was an era. Now, the two wouldn't be connected because between 2016 and 2017, for example, Astralis took over, VP won a whole bunch of tournaments when SK wasn't winning. You had all sorts of teams arise, and then eventually SK got back, but that was many, many months later. We're talking like 8 months or more later they got back to the top. So that can't be a continued era. It just wouldn't make sense for the term and terminology era. I count 2016 as an era, mainly because it was back-to-back majors, and then between that, they won a couple of tournaments, and then they had a very nice percentage of still finishing top 4 in finals before and after. So I think that's pretty fair to call era. It's the shortest era, but within it, it had some excellent dominance, like winning the 2 majors. In terms of 2017, I don't count any of that as an era because I count eras depending on 5-man lineups. So the 5 out of 6 tournaments weren't actually that sick. I've made a video about it in the past to have its own era. And then the 3 out of 4 with bolts is with bolts. And again, one of those is a fucking blast event that they barely won. And just generally not particularly interesting. Like 3 non-major events isn't enough to have an era on your own. So I don't combine 2016 and 2017. I don't combine 2017 and 2017 in the 2 different lineups. I separate them all out. And there was one era. It was in 2016. Yes, it's probably the most contentious of all the eras, but I still think it counts overall. And deservedly, if you look at that time period, I don't really see who really displaced them in that period. Like, okay, they lost ECS to G2. It's more important that they lost to ECS to G2 than G2 won ECS, in my opinion. So, similar with Malmo, the fact that they went out in the group stage was the big shock. Like, NiP winning that tournament didn't make them the number 1 team. Na'Vi winning it wouldn't have made it Nari's era. Like, for me, it was very much still the SK era. Jeremiah St. Pierre says, hello Thorin, you are the self-proclaimed esports historian. Addressed that many times. I'll leave it up to the audience. If you understand or don't understand that, fuck you or congrats either way. To which I would agree to. Don't really care whether you agree or not. However, I noticed that there is a lack of content from you on a certain popular esports genre. Oh boy, this will be good. I'm talking about fighting games. I'm assuming you probably don't have much interest in fighting games and their esports scene, so I would like to hear why. I personally think that fighting games have great competitive integrity, interesting personalities in the scene, and have hype/exciting tournaments. Right, first of all, I would say this. When you say that you notice a lack of content on a certain popular esports genre, I'm actually wondering how much you know about fighting games yourself. Because famously, for the last 10 years, every time the topic came up, the fighting game community has a general consensus and as an expert consensus from what I've seen, has repeatedly eschewed and resisted and basically had backlash against the premise of being brought under the umbrella of esports. They consider themselves their own things, fighting games, and they have their own community and they don't want to be considered esports, and hence why they have stupidly again and again and again bitten the hand that's fed them when E-League and other big esports tournament organisers and tournaments have reached out. Teams have even been involved. They've had stupid backlash from idiot hipster fans or people who want to believe they're more punk than you because they have a tattoo of their favourite band and you don't know all the lyrics to the first song by the band on the demo tape that they had back in 1983. It's the same arsehole behaviour 1,000 times over. And as usual, all the Johnny-come-latelys, like all the 15-year-old goths, are the ones that are going out of their way to make this their particular hobby their entire identity and call you a fraud as projection for the fact that they themselves know they themselves only just got into it, barely know much about it, and therefore their repeated attempts to demand or convince you that they are the most hardcore really comes from, as far as I can tell, from a place of immaturity and possibly even psychic weakness as a human being without characteristics beyond which video games you like. So that's the scene in a nutshell. Not a fan. I've also seen massive amounts of like overt racism within those scenes. Politically, they are an absolute fucking cesspit sewer that I would never waste 1 second of my life wading into. Like outrageously bigoted opinions and behaviour towards other people in their community. If you just look at the way they treated Richard Lewis, if that's a great barometer as to what a scene's like, fuck that entire scene. Nothing to be redeemed from it. As far as I can tell, some of the players are genius, the likes of Daigo, Justin Wong. Some of the tournaments look interesting. I'm not particularly interested in the games themselves. I don't find much aesthetically pleasing about fighting games. I don't get any kind of a hook in it in the same way as I do from Quake or Counter-Strike, where they had their initial immediate appeal. They have an aesthetic appeal. They have a deep tactical level and understanding and appeal. And then after that, the community is so off-putting that since I'm not super into the game anyway, and then luckily it's an incredibly small scene, it doesn't have much impact in my opinion on esports history, it's very easy for me to ignore it. There's still, as I say, there's not enough hours in the day to cover all the Counter-Strike, Quake, StarCraft, League of Legends stuff I want to cover, so why the fuck would I expand into another game, and one that would be actively hostile and complete arseholes to me anyway? No thanks. I think I'll go ahead and skip that. Jake C. Bishop. Now that I actually included this conversation, this question, even though Karrigan already is on Mousebots and that shit has sailed, because it's actually something that needs to be addressed. And this is now that Envy have gotten an additional $20 million investment, is it viable for them to build an international super team around Karrigan? And if they do, what is the best team they might be able to put together? Now, for anyone who doesn't know, first of all, some of these big investments that those teams are getting are explicitly in the understanding that they're going to get a franchised league spot in the LCS, the Overwatch League, the upcoming Call of Duty World League, CWL. These are the leagues which you go to the investor and say, I need to raise 10 million to buy, or 20 million, 25 million to buy a spot in this league. Therefore, that money basically is already accounted for. It's what you're going to use it for. The notion that you've just been given 20 million in unmarked bills to spend on anything you want with no accountability is half of the problem that we get to with any discussions about these investments, because people start thinking you've just got an extra 20 million in your bank. And now if you want, you can waste the first 5 million of that, sign a Nico and sign in fucking Device, and then getting in Cajun B, and then basically Karrigan gets all the players he wants. No. Odds are you're going to put extremely small amount of that 20 million towards CS. You're still only going to invest in CS if you think the investment's worth it, and then where you're going to position yourself, the industry's worth it, which Envy has shown no sign they do. They absolutely let their teams go after wasting many years and a lot of resources on the French side when it was mainly Hastro running the team. And so I personally think they could do it, but I don't think they would. I don't think they'd see the value in it. I know it was a big offer he had, and he could have put together a good team. I don't think super team. I don't think they would have spent that much money. I also think that would have been the best team they could have made at the time, but I don't think right now that they wanted to gamble and go from scratch, and that necessarily that's even worth the money right now. I think it's more about people who are already in the scene and understand the space very well, keeping teams. Or if you were going to gamble, I would want to buy an established team, because generally making teams is a lot more precarious than having a core and adding players to teams. There's a reason you've had certain cores be extremely successful time and time again, whereas absolutely you can put together teams that are super teams on paper that don't always succeed. Barbara Stanwyck's legs. Always quick questions from this guy. If in the first few years of Quake Live, they developed a top tier of duelers known as the Big Four. These were Rafa, Cypher, Cooler, and Avec. Looking over the totality of Quake Live from 2009 to 2016, would this Big Four remain intact in your view? And if not, what changes would you make? Right, so the main reason the Big Four developed is actually, I don't know whether this is how people originally thought of it, but it's very similar to basically what happened with the Big Four in tennis, where in tennis you had Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, and Murray, and over time, you could argue Djokovic maybe even moved to the top of the Big Four for this decade. And those were the Big Four, and as much as those were the four that were always making semis, that collectively won most of the championships, that won most of the ATP Masters. Now, what was always contentious was that Murray himself only won 3 Grand Slams, whereas like the minimum the other one won, I think was like 15 or 14, one of the other 3, although to be fair, Djokovic was considered one of the Big Four, even when they'd only won 1 or 2 himself. So people always used to say, why is he in there? It's because he was closer to the Big 3 than he was to whoever's number 5. Like, he won way more Grand Slams, although that's now debatable. And he had way more Masters, Championships, and overall records, and more like semis and finals of Grand Slams than anyone who was number 5. He was way closer to number 3 in that sense. So similarly, when we had Rafa, Cypher, Cooler, Avec, right, for a while, Cooler was the one that didn't have the championships. And then once he had the championships, it was Avec who didn't go as deep as the other 3. And generally, Rafa and Cypher are the 2 greatest players. And then I think overall, the interesting thing obviously becomes, as the years went on, Kilson, Sparty, Strengths had their own times. De Hang had times when they came up in the forefront. Most importantly, though, I think the only person who truly challenged the Big Four outside of for a single year is obviously Evil towards the end of the game. Now, he didn't get any of the really big LAN championships. Sadly, he didn't come along early enough to really test himself. When he started going to LANs, he was very, very good, but would always get beaten in the big semi or the big final. And quite frankly, he just didn't go hard enough early in Quake Live or didn't get adapted to LAN. So we never really got to see what he was capable of. I think he absolutely could have cracked this top 4. I think he could have displaced Avec and possibly even Cooler as well. The thing with Avec is he won too many championships to really take him out, even though he didn't have that many of the finals and top 4s overall. Cooler didn't have quite enough championships to really be contended with Rafa and Cypher. And then Rafa and Cypher had everything. So either you just make it Rafa and Cypher, or in my opinion, it should probably be a big 5 and have Evil in. I think those 5 really account for most of the history of Quake Live. Dang had some good finals and some nice performances towards the end. Strengths had a couple of years where he really hit a stride. Sparty was good in the beginning, but it wasn't as competitive back then. Kilson was more of a, I mean, he's a very consistent stylistic player, but he would just have the odd tournament, say 1 out of every 6 tournaments where he'd just do way better than he would elsewhere. Otherwise, you could kind of predict him to lose in the quarters and to lose to certain players and in a certain fashion. So I think it's only really that I would include Evil, or I would just remove them and have only the big 2, because by the end, the others didn't really contrast them as well, in my opinion. So I think that would be the fair way to do it. Spoonfed89 says, with Automatic seemingly the only salvageable part of the Cloud9 roster currently, this is obviously a few months ago, but I mean, you could arguably say it's the same right now. Like, how many players, if you had unlimited money, would you keep from Cloud9 tomorrow? Probably only Automatic, right? If you were the Cloud9 GM, what changes would you make in terms of both personnel and or playing style if you had to build around him as one of the stars of the team? Does he even justify being built around? The last point's probably the most key one. Overall, if you're making an NA roster, and it's explicitly to be an NA roster and compete within the NA region and represent NA as a region, right now, being as he can't take Team Liquid players, he's the most obvious person to build a team around, the best player to build around, and you would in that sense. Internationally, I'd rather go with a Simple, a Nico, a Ziwu, one of these players, and build around them if I'm building around superstar players. What I would want to do with an Automatic is put him with a good in-game leader that runs a system. They've done that with DAPS, could have done it with FNS, Sean Gares, any of these people, MSL. I'd put him with someone like that. Since I don't see him as like a number 1 star player, like he could potentially be, I don't know on the best team though. I see him better suited as a second player. So for example, I'd love to see him play with a Config or play with, I mean, stylistically, he's more similar to a Magisk, so it might not make sense to play with that type of a player. Basically play with a real alpha dog number 1 player, and then he will be a very consistent second player. You have a great star duo in that sense. Good thing is, he hasn't got a big ego, seems like a good teammate, so I think you can actually even add more spicy players, like your hybrid player. Could be someone with a bit more fiery, like a Cajun B, someone with a bigger attitude. I mean, obviously, in the modern day, he's not exactly the best 3rd star, but those are the players out there you can take. Fur, someone like that would be cool to pair with him. The good thing is, I think he could fit with a lot of players, but I want some big names around him. I want a proper system. I want a proper supportive element. And then I want to let him do his thing, which is be a semi-lurk player, be a big fragger, be one of my stars, but not the star. I don't want him to op too much. I'd make him hybrid, sometimes on certain maps op, but aside from that, mainly rifle, because I see him at his best, like players, like Magisk, for example. I think he's that type of a player when he has his rifle. Like, he'll just take player after player, he'll reset, he'll spray well. He's best when he has info coming into a scenario, as opposed to being the guy taking initiative, being proactive. So I do think he's a very good player. I don't think he's underrated in any sense, because I think people probably now overrate him because he hard carried so much in the really bad Cloud9s. But I do think he's a very good player in NA. He's certainly a top 3 or 4 player in the NA region, better than even some of the Team Liquid players for my money. It's just he doesn't fit their style, he plays in a different team. So I do think on some level I'd justify building around him. Guy Solomensky says, do you sometimes feel that you behave unethically as a journalist when you post stories and views on certain subjects? I don't mean the banter and the shit talking. That is obviously there for fun and for the amusement of the viewers. But I mean the part where you release behind the scenes info your audience wasn't previously previewed to. Right, I don't really understand the question. Why would it be unethical for me to reveal behind the scenes information? Right? First of all, if I do that, it's coming from a source who has told me the information in a way I've corroborated and I can now present to the audience. They haven't said, I want to be off record or I don't want to be mentioned at all. If they do, you don't ever find out about that information. Secondly, if I hear information but I can't corroborate it, I will only mention it in the fashion of a rumor. Like, this is not journalism. This is not something I'm revealing as a fact, but I have heard from people such and such. This is my opinion, or here's some info. It's just some info that is uncorroborated. I think that's entirely ethical to do in the way that I'm doing it. I don't think there's anything unethical at all, because I never betray anyone's confidence. I never take information that you're not allowed to say. There's only very, very rare instances I'll even tell an anecdote that someone hasn't told me I can explicitly say, and that tends to be where I know the person in question, or we vaguely talked around that and they were fine with it being known. So I don't really know where that's coming from, quite frankly. I feel like you have a very naive or almost childish perception of what ethics are to a journalist, and also what is right and what's wrong in that particular sense. Like, I'm not a slave to you because in a different part of my job, I work as a journalist and have to corroborate my facts. Like, that's not what I'm doing at all times in my life, and nobody can tell me I am, whether they think so or not. We can attempt to, but you'll find it's a fool's errand. Daniel Hambraeus says, when talking on desks, talk shows, or solo shows, how do you ensure you do not forget any important details? I don't, basically. Like, the main secret to how I'm as good as I am in my life is esports is my life and my hobby. So I spend an inordinate amount of time on it. I also think about it a lot as a secondary component of studying, following it. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. My work actually helps me figure some of those thoughts out, put them down, have to figure out models for them, connect them together, repeat them, expand some of them, develop ideas. So generally, I don't have to do that to prepare. I don't really have any problem in terms of remembering or forgetting. My philosophy is if you forget, probably wasn't that interesting, that important. That's why it didn't stick. If you remember, then what you do is you build many, many connections to the pieces of information that you remember because they're relevant. And therefore, there's always multiple ways back to it. So even if I forget the name of a player, I can always tell you, who was that guy who was like the really good AWPer who was on the Titans back in 2004? All right, KK, yeah. Like the point there is I'm not just like, oh, there's an AWPer I can't remember. I can always get you to the information, even if I myself don't have it at the end, because I have all these roots there. So, quite frankly, I've just spent a lot of time. Like, I've put in more hours doing desks, talk shows, and solo shows than almost anyone in the whole industry ever has. So, is it any wonder I'm at a higher level or have a better skill set, more developed skill set than them? I don't think so. I've also used the information I talk about more and thought about the ideas more than anyone else have. I remember them, therefore they mean something to me. Therefore, I can always call them up at any moment. Sometimes if I'm tired, I haven't had enough food, I haven't had enough caffeine that day, maybe I might occasionally, or had certain other extracurricular activities within my life. Maybe I'll have certain things I can't fully remember, but then I just skip it and I go to something more interesting. The key for me is I'll never be unable to talk about stuff, because if I don't have something great now, I'll switch over and talk about something else. I can always shape the topic and move the direction of it and always have something interesting to say that hasn't yet been talked about or discussed enough, in my opinion. Right, Jerky's Minion, we'll end on this one from my boy who supports me. What's the most important piece, I assume advice, for younger players to understand when trying to get better at CS? Right, it's something I know that Steele, former in-game leader of Ghost Gaming, has reiterated many, many times, and I agree with him, is understanding basic fundamental positional play and the principles behind them. So whether that's as a terrorist, the way you're going to entry, where you're going in, the audio going in, it's most notably seen as CT, how you play a spot, what angles you take, how aggressively you play it, how you use utility, how you drop off, how you communicate. Everyone wants to be simple. Everyone wants to do the highlight play and the crazy play and the amazing shit. No one wants to be Zipniks. No one wants to be Crims and learn the boring aspects of the correct angles, the correct time to fall back, when to come, when to throw a flash, when to be safe, when to play conservative, when to play by the numbers. And yet, this is, in my opinion, the number one secret to leveling up your game. All the truly great players have some aspect to which their fundamental positioning and understanding of principles of how to play the spot is at a high level. Even Simple, he went through a different route. He went through his own alien route of playing to the absolute limits of his game, but as a result, he has spots and angles and principles that for him make sense and are fundamentally correct, but that wouldn't be for you. So I would actually say, first and foremost, go and watch players like Zipniks and Crims and look what they're doing on CT side or when they go in on T side and look at the basic principle, or try to understand the simple concept of what they're doing, what they're looking for and why they made that decision, and start applying it to your own game and be very harsh with yourself and make yourself play in a very disciplined manner in this sense. And then once you have those fundamentals down, you can expand it out and be a bit more aggressive, throw people for a loop a little bit, keep them honest, try some spontaneous stuff. But the default of your game should be the de facto fundamentals of the game. That's probably the most misunderstood aspect of the game. Everyone out there searching for the next mouse, sensitivity, they're trying to hit a crazier shot, they're trying to AWP if they're a rifler, they're trying to be better at rifles if they're an AWPer, they're trying to deagle everyone, they're trying to use a CZ to get crazy kills from behind someone's back. No, work on the basics of the game with your USP, with your Glock, with your AK, with your M4A, with your AUG, with your AWP. Look at the most safe players. Look at the players that play the smartest. Those are the players you can learn the most from. You can learn way more from Crimson Zipniks than you can from Simple or from Fur. Right, as I always say, but this time it'll be true, there will be upcoming future episodes much, much sooner. In fact, when you see this video, go and check on Patreon and there will be a new thread up. This video was kindly supported by Patrick Ribeiro, Penguin Off 9, Dean Tanglis, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Fat Guy got 24 ADR in an online qualifier, Lee Chaolan, Blunt Smoking Anus Destroyer, JDubs, Chi Mao, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, Alexander Rao, Kolja G, and as always, special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Now, do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for some of my content? Obviously, I have quite a varied output. Do you want to ask me a question for my monthly video AMA? Maybe you want teasers, see who the guests are on my next shows. Do you want to take part in a donator discussion with me about esports? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Scrilluminati today. In the description box below, there's a Patreon link.